Hello, and welcome back to another round of VR benchmarking. Today we're going to be taking a look at the question of, is SteamVR really that much of a performance hog, specifically on Pimax headsets? If you check around online, you'll see a number of people that say SteamVR is a huge drain on resources and performance, and if you have a non-native HMD, you're always better off using the native OpenXR runtime to bypass it entirely, to where programs like OpenComposite have been made to try and translate OpenVR into OpenXR for that express purpose, some swearing by the performance gains they get from it. But some of you may be confused by what all these terms mean and why they're important. So let's take a moment to discuss that in brief and why they can impact your performance. This will just be a brief overview as the focus is on benchmarking. Let's take a look at this handy little chart made by Mbusha, who is responsible for developing several OpenXR apps, including the OpenXR toolkit. You could think of OpenVR and OpenXR as kind of like a runtime for the VR process, a little bit like DX11 versus DX12 in very simple terms. If you look around the middle of the chart and compare these two specifically, this is why people say SteamVR takes resources and performance. Because if you have a native OpenXR runtime, you're going through less compositor layers by bypassing SteamVR, which takes less time and processing power in theory. Or to look at a very simplified way, it takes you less time to go through one door than it does through two. But this is not directly SteamVR's fault, it's just the fact that non-native headsets generally go through those extra layers, and most people are running through like an Oculus, which is quite infamous for not playing nicely with SteamVR. Same thing can happen with Revive for non-Oculus headsets. The big exceptions to all this are things like the Valve Index, which is a native SteamVR headset, so in that case, it is its OpenXR runtime. Now this is all in theory. In practice, it isn't always that simple, and this can depend on the individual compositor alongside the game and how it's coded. You'll see what I mean a bit later, which is why I'm doing the video and benchmarking. I'm going to be looking at three things primarily today: OpenVR versus OpenXR via SteamVR and PimaxXR, the unofficial native runtime for Pimax HMDs, as some games support both of them. Then OpenVR versus OpenComposite for games which don't natively have OpenXR support, but this program again translates OpenVR to OpenXR, often with some mixed results, but we'll talk about that later. And then lastly, games which support only OpenXR with SteamVR versus PimaxXR. If you want to know which one the game you're playing with is using, there's a quick way to check. Open up the game's folder and search for OpenVR or OpenXR in it. If the game has OpenVR API, it supports OpenVR. If you find OpenXR Loader, then that means it should support OpenXR. Not always the case, but usually this check works. As for how to use these tools, links in the software for everything mentioned or used in the video will be in the description below. Most have their own guides. Test configuration-wise, I have an RTX 4090 7950X3D Affinity Mass Use of V-Cache cores for the game, 6000 MHz CL30 DDR6 RAM, and then the Pimax Crystal here, running at 4312 by 5100 per eye, unless noted otherwise. This is being done on the Crystal, but it should be applicable to all Pimax HMDs, and because this is more testing the efficiency of their compositor. A few quick disclaimers though. Firstly, I am using a new method here compared to my old videos, which means that the usual one about recording penalty does not apply because I do not need to record my runs and lose a couple frames. A lot of the games I'm benchmarking also have gotten some pretty major updates, and in the case of Skyrim, an entirely new mod list is being used, so don't compare these results to the old videos because of that. Please also watch in 1440p or 4K even if you're on a 1080p display, because it gives a higher bitrate, and for some reason certain graphs look kinda crunchy and weird when watching at 1080p or lower. Not sure why, nothing I can do with the program I use. Sorry about that. Secondly, these are applicable to just Pimax. They don't translate to, say, Oculus, as they use their own implementation of OpenVR and OpenXR. If there is demand, though, maybe I will run this setup on a Quest 3 looking at the various runtimes you can use with it. It has a lot more options between Oculus Virtual Desktop, SteamVR, with those, and Steam Link. Thirdly, motion smoothing was disabled for all these benchmarks, so it wouldn't interfere with the results. And lastly, to save a good bit of time not needing to constantly repeat OpenVR and OpenXR, for the rest of the video, I'm going to be referring to OpenVR as OVR and OpenXR as OXR. That said, let's dive into the results.
First up is AirCar, which is OVR native and using OpenComposite for OXR. Because this game provided a good example of an important point is why I'm benchmarking it. I have two graphs I'm going to look at. If you look at the average and lows, when looking at OVR versus OXR via SteamVR, you can see the logic I talked about and the chart mentioned earlier about having less layers to go through is true. OpenComposite is designed around avoiding SteamVR, and you wouldn't normally do this, but thoroughness compelled me to test it, and this shows a real-world example of what I mentioned earlier, since it's both using SteamVR. Using OpenComposite with SteamVR instead of native OVR resulted in OVR having 6.1% better average FPS, 5.9% 1% lows, and 3.4% improved 0.1% lows. This is a small gap, but it was consistent between runs. However, if we move to how the software is meant to be used with PimaxXR here, the behavior is rather strange and not what you'd expect with the prior results. Average FPS versus OVR increased by 2.6%. Yes. Yet OVR has 31.6% better 1% lows and 6.9% improved 0.1% low. You sure as hell feel this in VR. However, I want to take a more in-depth look at this using another chart to explain why this is. This graph shows the frame times relative to the recording. In the case of frame times, lower is better because it means that the GPU is taking less time to deliver the next frame and can get it to your HMD faster. If we look at the SteamVR associated runtimes, they look quite similar in overall shape, increasing and decreasing at roughly the same spots. But OVR is overall performing better, so its place on the graph is overall lower. This is good because having a stable frame time without a bunch of spikes means that the experience in the headset is smoother, as you're not ping-ponging between low and high frame rates all the time. And meeting your headset's hertz is important for smoothness in a manner somewhat like why people value free or G-Sync on monitors for the sake of motion fluidity. It's why a stable 75 to 90 FPS can feel better and smoother than bouncing between 75 and 120 all the time. It's also a reason why a perfectly stable 60 Hz with motion reprojection to 120 can appear visually smoother than having inconsistent frame rate without it. But let's look at what happens when we throw PimaxXR's results into the mix. The frame rate consistency is in the dumpster. Even if we have part of the graph technically with better frame times than with SteamVR, it's because the FPS is all over the place and constantly swinging between high and low. Half the time it may be better, sure, but half the time it's a lot worse than OVR. Inside the actual headset, this results in a terrible feeling experience because of the inconsistency. It's almost like having constant judder, and things don't look right or smooth as with OVR because of it, despite the slightly higher average FPS. And just looking at that wouldn't tell you just how extremely out of whack the overall frame pacing is. This is why the average and lows are important, but they may not also tell the full story. However, things are not always this extreme. Let's look at Project Wingman, which is OVR, though the beta branch does have native OXR, but it's too unstable for me to test. And looking at it, things kind of look a bit better for OpenComposite. OpenComposite with SteamVR displays the same consistent issues of performance regression, so not much to say there. But using it with PimaxXR did technically get us some more performance, but it was only about a 5.1% increase on both the average FPS and 1% low. While the 0.1% low with OVR were 8.5% better than with OpenComposite. This is not a lot, and it's sort of a you win some, you lose some. If we go to the frame time graph, we can see that things do look a lot better here compared to AirCar. However, it is again still a bit awkward. SteamVR in general does have noticeably more stable overall frame rate, but PimaxXR does spend a decent chunk of time below what OVR's best is and doesn't spike up anywhere near as badly as AirCar. But in terms of absolute performance gains, like I said, you win some, you lose some, and I probably wouldn't bother with OpenComposite here, considering it's not that big of an increase and you do lose out in the 1% lows. But if you really want to use PimaxXR, then it is an option. And now we're at Skyrim, running the July 10th, at the time the latest, update of Mad God's Overhaul at 3232 by 3824 per eye with DLAA and NVIDIA Reflex, but otherwise stock settings with. And this has a lot to talk about. Perhaps because this is using a customized version of OpenComposite made specifically for it. If you look at the chart, you'll notice right now I only have 5 runs of PimaxXR. That's because I first want to talk about how OpenComposite behaved with it, because here it was very inconsistent. The average FPS stayed around the same, and the 1% low varied by only around 5% for the most part, except for one run where the best one did around 16% better than the worst. But the 0.1% low are all over the place. The worst run was 36.41 FPS, while the best was 52.71 FPS, which is a 44.8% increase. And while that's bad, if you do discount as an outlier and take the second worst, then there's only a 12.1% improvement from 46.86 to 52.71 FPS, but that's still a notable amount. But then the middle ground of the road option has the best ones doing about 5 to 6% better. And this isn't just a case of early runs doing worse while later ones stabilize, because the first run was the best overall. Second run had dramatically worse lows, while the fifth run had the third worst 0.1% low at 49.86 FPS versus the best run's 52.71. So this is kind of a horrid mess. And this is the only game where I saw such a wild variance while doing multiple runs. Every other game varied around 5% or so between runs at absolute worst. Most of the runs just had 3% or less. Skyrim is a weird anomaly with these inconsistent results. Before we look at the other ones, I want to take a little deeper look at run number 1, the best overall, with run number 3, which is the worst overall. We discount run number 2 as a possible outlier because of how bad the 0.1% low were. It is quite apparent how run number 1 has far more tightly controlled spikes. There are points where it technically has a slightly worse frame time, but the overall consistency is much better in certain spots. And even when it loses some stability, run number 1's worst spike, beyond some outliers, are staying through where run number 2 hovers through a large portion of the run. These ended within around 1/5 of a second of each other and were done in the same spot. So I can't explain the inconsistency. Going back to the graphs, comparing OVR and SteamVR OXR to the best and technically the second worst run for PimaxXR, things are a little bit interesting. SteamVR, both with OpenComposite and without, have basically identical performance. About a 1 to 2% difference on the 1% lows and average FPS though. Truly world-shattering stuff. Backed up to PimaxXR though, average FPS compared to both runs is a pretty decent difference. Around plus 10 to 12% in favor of PimaxXR, which is meaningful. But as with most of the comparisons so far, the 1% and 0.1% low are where things are getting a little bit dicey. The 0.1% low compared to the worst run was basically identical at about 47 FPS for all three, but compared to the best run, PimaxXR is doing about 12% better, up to 52.51 FPS. On 1% low, OVR had a 5.2% improvement over the worst PimaxXR run, but the best one had a 10.4% improvement over OVR. So if you consistently got the best results, a double-digit increase is meaningful. Briefly checking over the frame time plot of these four, we can still see the same trend. SteamVR's overall frame rate stability is really tight and well controlled. The worst PimaxXR run has quite less stability overall, pinging between about 10 and 20 milliseconds often. The best PimaxXR run is, meanwhile, a lot closer to SteamVR's. And yes, if you really do want to split hairs, the overall stability is less, but the performance is just better overall, and there are several points where stability is quite similar. I have stressed frame time stability a good bit during this video, but it's also important to keep in mind that a little bit here and there isn't that bad, and it's going to be very hard for most people to notice, unless it's as bad as something like, say, with AirCar. But with this all said, I'm still a little cautious to recommend OpenComposite unconditionally here, given how inconsistent the general run-to-run variance was. I'd probably just stick with OVR myself because I know the performance is very tight on it, but this is a game where I still could recommend at least trying OpenComposite comfortably, unlike some of the other two. Maybe just keep a little bit of an eye on your frame times. And now we get to a few games which supported both OpenVR and OpenXR. These defaulted to OVR with Pimax, but could be forced to run in OVR via the launch command -HMD equals OpenXR. And first up we have KayakVR Mirage. Run at all max settings with TAA and no upscaling. OXR with SteamVR and OVR had both similar average FPS and 0.1% lows, about a 1% difference between the two, but OVR had 7.3% improved 1% lows, which was replicable across various runs. PimaxXR is doing worse all around though. SteamVR is doing about 8 to 9.5% better on average FPS, and OVR's 1% lows are improved by 6.1%. 0.1% 1% lows are about the same. Overall frame pacing was similar considering the FPS difference. OVR and PimaxXR kind of trade blows in that sometimes the frame pacing is better in some areas while it is worse than others. But there's not a whole lot of unusual things, so no need to spend a lot of time on the chart here. Just use OVR for Kayak. Next up is Zero Caliber. SteamVR's two options are basically identical, so I'm going to be focusing on OVR versus PimaxXR here. While OVR only had 3% improved FPS, 108.11 versus PimaxXR's 104.98, in the lows, it demolishes PimaxXR in what is the most brutal blowout so far. 1% lows on OVR are a staggering 31.4% better than PimaxXR, while the 0.1% low likewise go up by 27.8%. That is a tremendous difference you will feel, especially when the frame rate in general is as inconsistent as this. But there's some interesting reasons for these results. Briefly looking at the frame time plot, PimaxXR again has some pretty significant spikes and poor consistency. But unlike some of the other ones where we usually see it occurring through most of the run, here it's largely in the first third or so. By the second half, it stabilizes and has a pretty similar consistency to the other two, though it is still somewhat spikier. This isn't a shader compilation thing because I did run through this before benchmarking, and PimaxXR was also the last one I did, so I'd done plenty of runs, and I did find consistent behavior in multiple runs, and this just seems to showcase a general trend that SteamVR's frame timings are overall more consistent. And now we move on to Propagation Paradise Hotel, which did launch with OXR via SteamVR, but I could not get any of the bindings to work for the life of me, even after fiddling around for a good 40 minutes, so I couldn't run my benchmark. So this is OVR versus PimaxXR only, and it's another knockout for OVR. Average FPS did not even differ by 1%, but yet again, we are seeing the lows reflect generally tighter consistency in SteamVR. The 1% lows are better on OVR by a whole 20.1%. Not exactly surprising numbers at this point, but that is quite a significant margin. And this holds even more true if we flip over to the frame time graph. What do you know? The exact same frame pacing issues we've seen are still there. It's bad overall, but right at the end, things get truly terrible versus SteamVR. An inversion of what we saw in Zero Caliber, where the early part was the bad one. And I just want to briefly note RE8 using Praydog's VR mod to illustrate that there can be cases where SteamVR, OXR, and OVR perform essentially identically. Difference here is basically just run-to-run variance is not the norm based on the results so far, but it can happen. PimaxXR isn't on here though because RE8 would crash every time I tried, so I couldn't even benchmark it. Not much to say here. Let's move on to the titles which have native OpenXR only. And now we are at the big one. The one that people were probably using to prepare angry comments to defend PimaxXR with, given how much I have ragged on it so far, admittedly. This is Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. And if you are one of those people, you're sort of right. Because, again, there is a lot to talk about with this one. Flying over New York with clear skies, no traffic, and multiplayer disabled on medium settings, except for texture-related settings set to max, with DLSS quality and DX11, PimaxXR blows SteamVR the hell out in one of the biggest differences I saw in any test. Average FPS may have only improved by 7.9% with PimaxXR versus SteamVR, from 49.5 to 53.41 FPS, but the lows are a stunning massacre. PimaxXR has 44.9 and 36.8% improved 1% and 0.1% loads respectively, jumping from 30.84 and 28.3 FPS with SteamVR all the way to 38.72 and 44.68 FPS. This is like a generational improvement. You will have a measurably worse experience using SteamVR for this game with a Pimax headset. At least if you use the DirectX 11 runtime. This is the reason why I've showcased the runtime in every test so far, so I can prove what I'm about to say isn't universal and can vary from game to game. MSFS has both DirectX 11 and DirectX 12 officially, and when I switched over to the DX12 renderer, the margin suddenly narrowed significantly, because SteamVR is now performing far better than with DX11. PimaxXR is technically doing better, but the most significant difference now is average FPS and 1% lows at a mere 7% higher with PimaxXR. But the 0.1% low is only 3% better. So PimaxXR is performing higher, but is nowhere near the literal generational jump that was happening with DX11. And this was all consistent behavior too. Nor was it simply me being CPU bound, as I did check with FPS VR and MSFS built-in dev tools. Neither indicates CPU bottlenecking here on the 7950X3D. Let's go check out the frame time plot with DX11 first, because it's quite easy to see why SteamVR's lows are so horrible. The issue with PimaxXR, where it tended to have worse frame time consistency in other games, is now completely reversed here. SteamVR is the one which has terrible frame pacing and is constantly pinging up and down on frame rate. There's no word for it other than abysmal. PimaxXR has a far smoother and tighter frame pacing, which leads to an overall better experience and those much improved lows. But if we look at the DX11 frame time plot, the overall shape between PimaxXR and SteamVR is pretty similar. They both even have nearly identical huge spike in roughly the same spot. PimaxXR just generally does slightly better. So yes, if you want the best performance, PimaxXR is the way to go, but if you want to use SteamVR for reasons like overlays, I'd advise giving DX12 a try. You don't really lose that much. But do be aware this can potentially depend on the system, as in cases where a game supports multiple DX runtimes, I've seen it vary from person to person as what's best. This may explain why some people find such huge improvement with MSFS though, as DX11 is the default runtime. Next up is a recent big release, Riven. This is a demanding title, so it was tested at medium settings, safe for ultra view distances and textures, and DLSS quality. PimaxXR had 12.2 and 7.2% better average FPS and 1% low respectively than SteamVR. But on the other hand, SteamVR had 8.2% better, 0.1% low. But something very important to note here is that on these settings, and where I tested at least, PimaxXR did manage to get basically around 90 FPS, which in VR is a very important threshold to hit. Moving over to the frame time plot just for validation, it's the same story as a lot of other games. SteamVR does have overall worse performance, but the frame time consistency is tighter, and that is reflected in the 0.1% low improvement. But PimaxXR does spend a good bit of time below SteamVR's best frame times, and compared to some other examples, the consistency difference is not that big, but it is still present. You could really go with either runtime, as both have the pros and cons, but PimaxXR will have better overall performance, if not across the whole board. And here we have another OpenXR only title, Legendary Tales. You know how this tends to go by now. PimaxXR has a 5% improvement on average FPS, 118.32 to SteamVR's 102.69, but SteamVR is dominating in the lows, with 11.8 and 17.5% improved 1% and 0.1% low respectively. Just to validate the data, checking the frame time graph, there is actually a decent number of places where PimaxXR has similar to even slightly better frame rate consistency, but it gets far worse in SteamVR at the 52 to 65 second mark, and it stays that way. While SteamVR's performance worsens, but it still maintains the same overall pattern in between the better FPS, I'd just say it's the way to go. And last up is Pavlov, tested with ultra settings, but medium AA and no quad views on Stalingrad. In this case, SteamVR just beats PimaxXR all around. Average FPS is only 2.8% better, but the 1% and 0.1% lows have a huge improvement of 23.8 and 34.6% better respectively. The second biggest margins after MSFS, where PimaxXR had a brutal domination with the X11. The frame time plot is exactly what you expect at this point, so we don't have to dwell on it for long. Let's move on.
So, there's all the data. Let's discuss a few key takeaways. Overall, when it comes to the whole idea of SteamVR having significant overhead for Pimax headsets, that generally does not seem to be true, based on what I've seen and then some brief benchmarks I've seen from others using, say, the Quest. And the reason I would say this is partially because of how, at least from my understanding, Pimax handles their compositor interactions with SteamVR in a very selfish way. It likes to hijack a lot of SteamVR's functions to route them through Pimax instead, seemingly to try and remove as much overhead as possible. I believe this is one reason why you had things like the inability to get tracker battery life the normal way, till a recent update lets you finally do that, and also had issues with things like the ETs or Tundras not working for a while. And I can get why some people would have issues with that. But when it comes to performance, this has definitely paid off, as the vast majority of the time it's simply better to use SteamVR or you're not losing that much. Even in cases where OpenVR and OpenXR are both options, OVR just generally tends to be the better one, as Pimax has worked heavily around that, at the expense of their own OXR implementation, granted. PimaxXR is third-party, though they did work closely with Pimax in some official support. However, there are still some cases where PimaxXR does provide an uplift, but there were only 3 instances where provided an uplift of 10% or greater. And 2 of those instances, one of them had some runs with meaningful double-digit gains, yes, but it was kinda worryingly inconsistent across multiple runs, in the case of Skyrim. While with MSFS, it had huge gains with DX11. Those gains practically vanished when switching to DX12 though, and PimaxXR only performed around 3 to 7% better there, which is an improvement, making it still worth using, but it's not huge. The only one which was completely unconditional was Riven, but SteamVR still had better 0.1% lows in that case, though I'd still recommend PimaxXR be used there too. And in some cases, using PimaxXR was actively worse, particularly when it came to overall frame time consistency, as even discounting OpenComposite due to being somewhat janky, it was still an issue in a handful of games. Basically, every other instance I have not mentioned so far, SteamVR was preferable, even when using OpenComposite. And yes, there were cases where we technically saw barely higher average FPS, but the overall frame rate consistency was often just a good bit worse, with more ping-ponging between high and low FPS, which sucks in VR. So given all this, and from my personal findings, I wouldn't recommend OpenComposite. Perhaps there are some games out there which would respond well to it given the game-to-game differences we saw here, but in what I tested, it was just generally a bad idea. You could make a case for Skyrim if the results were more consistent, as a good run did see around plus 12% gains, but there were also a few runs doing worse in areas, 0.1% lows in particular. Even aside from that, I wanted to try more games to test out, but the program just gave me endless headaches, to the point where I was actually worried if I'd even get enough games to properly test it. I experienced issues from them not launching at all, motion controls not working, inputs not functioning right. It just... I don't think it's worth it on Pimax. You don't really gain much of anything, even when it does work for the most part. And maybe there are some games out there which do work with it, but I would probably just advise to stop recommending it. If you're going to argue that in the comments, go check the frame time consistency and not just your FPS first, especially if you're just using the current or average. Please. Generally speaking, while there were exceptions which prevent me from making a universal generalization and prefer one over the other, if you want to keep things simple, just stick with SteamVR. Pimax does not really appear to have a meaningful overhead with SteamVR, at least on a consistent basis. If you have OpenVR available, just stick with that. It's the best option and what Pimax's native foveated rendering works with. But if the game is OpenXR only, it may be worth at least trying PimaxXR. You might run into a situation like Riven where you get more than just a few %, or if you absolutely need every last little frame, you might squeeze out a few extra where it really matters, like with MSFS. But I would just generally default to SteamVR first, it's way more consistent overall. Unfortunately, VR is just kinda complicated like this, but I could only test so many games. Even if I think I have a decent sample size. Have you tested some other games with different results than I have? Are you surprised at the results here with how much some people swear SteamVR is a performance black hole? Let me know in the comments. If you made it to the end here, consider sticking around to see what I do next. And if not, maybe I'll see you in the recommendeds again sometime. Later!